Hey everybody, happy Friday. So I'm jumping on a little bit earlier today than I had planned to do because I've had some schedule changes with the day. So I wanted to go ahead and get this in while I have a chance to do it. So today is day 5. I feel like I deserve like a medal or a gold star or something for doing 5 lives, 5 days in a row. It's a big deal. So I'm excited to be wrapping this up. This week I've been going through and giving some really simple tips and strategies and techniques to kickstart weight loss or health, just some simple things that you can implement in right away. So we're gonna finish up this week talking about how to manage cravings and urges, right? Because this whole thing would be really, really simple if it wasn't for the fact that we have these things that we desire that we then kind of think aren't really necessarily serving us. And how do we do that? So first of all, I think it's really important that we don't get into a perfectionistic mindset or feel like if we don't do it, 100% right and eat perfectly healthy all the time that we can't reach our goals. That's not how it works. Usually for most people, I like the 80-20 rule. So aiming for these healthy habits about 80% of the time. If you're going for weight loss, you might take that up just a notch and do like a 90-10. But certainly, we don't want to get into that super perfectionistic kind of mindset. That being said, I know a lot of people who feel stuck in a cycle of trying to break some habits, feeling like they can't, then feeling a lot of shame, feeling really bad about that. So they try harder, they fail again, and it's like piling and piling and piling, and they get to a place of feeling really discouraged and really hopeless. And a big part of that is because the way that most of us know to approach habit change or to manage, urges and cravings is to use willpower, right? And willpower is actually a great tool to use for a very short-term period of time, right? Like if I have to push through to finish up a project, right? Or push through to finish up my workout or get myself to the gym, I can use a little bit of willpower to do that. And that's great. And obviously, like anything, the more I use willpower, the stronger it gets. But it's not a great thing to use long-term. And it's not a great thing to use to break a habit. Analogy you might hear is like trying to push a big beach ball under the water. Eventually your strength's going to run out, and not only is the beach ball going to pop back up, but it's going to come flying up out of the water much more forcefully than if we hadn't pushed it under in the first place. And that's what I know a lot of people experience is they try to be really good and willpower for like a 30-day plan or something like that. It's not that the plan is wrong, it's the way they're approaching it. And so they get to the end of that 30 days and not only do they go back and start doing the habits again, but they're oftentimes ping-ponging to kind of a much more indulgent place. So they just feel like they're constantly going back and forth between, indulgence, which is fun, but feels like it's getting some unwanted results or consequences, and then trying to be super strict, but it feels really hard and like they're having to use up all their mental energy. So I teach managing urges and cravings a little bit differently, and I want to share that with you today. So the first thing I want to talk about is that why we crave things in the first place. It's really important that we don't ever label that as something is wrong with us or that we're bad because we enjoy, certain foods or certain things. It's really important. It's actually really, really normal, and it actually means that everything is working exactly like it's supposed to be. Hey, Nicole. So what is happening in our brain is that we're actually creating or have created a really strong neural pathway. So if you happen to watch my training from yesterday, I talked about a bit about thought patterns. On Wednesday, I talked about dopamine and how it kind of plays a role into all of this. So oftentimes what is happening is that we get a desire for something, or we have some sort of a trigger that makes us desire something, usually something that's going to give us that hit of dopamine, right? And it's that desire that starts to come up that we are feeling, that is that urge or that craving. And then all of a sudden we're stuck in this situation where it's like, oh no. And the way I describe it is it's wanting to do something that I don't really want to do, right? It's like, I want the ice cream, but I don't want the ice cream. And all of a sudden we're in this like mental battle, and we're trying to willpower, and I want to be good, but I don't want to be good. And it just is exhausting. It kind of drains our energy. So even if we're able to kind of like get through that one time, it feels like the urge is just getting stronger and stronger and stronger until, again, we sort of just break down and we go crazy and eat like the entire gallon of ice cream or something, right? So there is this really great experiment. You might have heard of it. I was a psychology major, so we studied this in school, and you might have heard of it too, of Pavlov's dogs, right? So basically what happened was he had some dogs, and he would feed them, and they would salivate when they were about to get fed in anticipation of the food. So he did this experiment, and he started to ring a bell every time he was about to feed them, right? So over time, the dogs started to associate bell, food. And so it got to the point where he could just ring the bell and never present them with food, and they would salivate. They were, anticipating something pleasurable. And so that was sort of how he conditioned them. And then in order to decondition them, what he had to do was ring the bell and not bring the food. So the dogs would salivate, but then they wouldn't get the reward. And over time, they started to disassociate the bell ringing with the food, right? And so a lot of times when we have some sort of ongoing habit that we're trying to break, it's really the exact same thing. Something has become a trigger for us, and it could be a number of things. It could just be the time of day, like, oh, it's the kids just went to bed. This is when I, whatever, right, get into the pantry or open the bottle of wine or whatever it is. It could be a certain thought that triggers it, right? Like, my boss was such a jerk today, right? I need something to comfort me. It might be it's the weekend and I want to have fun. There can be a ton of different triggers, right? And none of those in and of themselves are necessarily bad unless, again, it's causing us to act against our own will, or it's creating consequences in our life that we don't want anymore, right? And then again, we try to break it, it doesn't work, and then we start this cycle of feeling really bad. So we just have to understand that we have these specific triggers, again, whether it's a habit, it's a thought, it's an emotion, that then all of a sudden causes, it's like the bell ringing that causes the desire to rise up. And typically what we do is we then answer the desire with the thing, right, with the food, so to speak, or actually the food, and we sort of complete this neural pathway, right? So there's trigger, desire, reward, trigger, desire, reward, trigger, desire, reward. And when we go to try to break that, right, like, okay, I'm starting my diet on Monday, I'm not going to do it anymore, and we don't understand the power of that dopamine, because again, if you've heard me talk about dopamine this week, dopamine isn't just a feel-good hormone. It's actually a very driving hormone, right? And the more powerful a substance is, the more it releases it, the harder it is to break the cycle of having that. Our brain is like, this is the most important thing ever, right? This is why you see people that are on like hardcore drugs who might neglect their own children. You think, how in the world can they do that? That's the power of the dopamine, right? It's so powerful, and your brain actually believes it's more important than anything else, right? So for me, once I kind of understood that, it helped a lot just to know what was going on, right? Instead of being like, well, gosh, something's wrong with me. Because I know I thought that for a long time. Like, why am I so drawn to sugar or wine or whatever? And again, it doesn't mean those things in and of themselves are bad or that we can never have them. It's, again, when we feel like we're sort of acting against our own will and then we're trying to willpower and it's not working and we're in this sort of vicious cycle, right? So the other example I give, or the way I sort of describe this and talk about this with my clients, is I say we have this part of our brain, this more primitive part that I call the toddler brain. So I call it like the prefrontal cortex is our more evolved brain. It's what we use to think and plan and process and delay gratification. And then our toddler brain is like our more primitive brain. And so the example I always give is like, if you have a toddler, if you were to take them, let's just say to Target, and every time you went, you allowed them to get a toy, right? Of course, that child is going to start to associate Target with toy. And then just imagine one day that you take the child to Target and you're like, oh, we're not getting a toy today, right? And all the moms out there are like, because you know it's going to happen, right? The child is going to freak out. They're going to have a temper tantrum. They're going to be very upset. They don't understand, right? Wait, when we go to Target, we get a toy. What do you mean I don't get a toy anymore, right? And it's kind of the same thing that's happening in our brain. So that toddler brain, that more primitive brain, when we suddenly cut off this thing that we've been giving it that's pleasurable, that releases dopamine, your brain is going to kind of freak out. It's going to have a temper tantrum. And so what we really want to do over time is just kind of decondition it gently away from that thing, right? So we want to start to break that cycle. And we just have to understand that in the beginning, it is going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Our brain is going to kind of freak out. But here's the cool thing. Just like we talked about, hunger comes in waves, so do those urges. So when we willpower something and we're like, I'm just going to avoid it and not think about it and just be good and put my head down, and if I even, just don't let me see any ice cream or whatever, that's when it builds and it gets stronger, right? But when we just sort of allow it and we're like, yep, my brain's freaking out and it's trying to convince me and it's trying to tell me it's no big deal, just do it this once, you'll be fine. We just sort of observe that and allow it and don't fight it. That's when it actually starts to dissipate. And not only will it dissipate in the moment, but over time, our brain will learn to disassociate, right? Because if you go back to the toddler and Target example, if your child has a temper tantrum and you're like, okay, fine, here, have the toy. Now they're also learning, oh, well, I just have a temper tantrum and I'll get the toy, right? So our brain's kind of doing the same thing in the beginning. We just have to teach it like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that anymore, right? And let it kind of freak out a little bit, right? And my clients are always like, oh, my brain has the most convincing arguments, and it will. Now, one of the things that we practice is actually allowing urges. And I have a worksheet where we actually track up to 100 urges. And the idea there is to understand it's not something that just happens in one day or 1 week, right? It's something that we practice over time to, again, disassociate, right? So take someone that's had a habit like smoking. And there might have been a time when every time they, let's say, got in the car to drive, their brain's like, oh, we're getting in the car. This is when we smoke, right? And then they decide they're going to quit smoking. They get into the car. That's the trigger. The brain is like, oh, this is when we smoke. This is when we have the pleasure. You're cutting that neural pathway saying, no, we don't. The urge is still going to be there, right? But every time you allow that urge without responding, without giving the reward, it dissipates a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So I think understanding that and knowing that this is actually going to get easier and that desire is going to lessen versus feeling like this is going to get harder and harder and harder. I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. I'm not going to be able to hold that beach ball under the water anymore. Understanding that difference is everything, right? Because one, we feel like it's going to overtake us, and the other one, we know we just keep doing this, right? Now, that doesn't mean you can't have the pleasurable thing, but what you want to do is you want to plan it out with the prefrontal cortex. So if you're like, I want to have a glass of wine on Friday night, as long as you're planning it out versus it becoming this sort of emotional response in the moment. That's the difference between the toddler brain and using the adult brain or the prefrontal cortex. So you can incorporate those things in however you want, but when we're doing it from the prefrontal cortex, we're able to see the whole big picture, right? And so rarely are we going to plan out something that's really, going to give us consequences that we don't want over the long haul, right? But be really, really, really compassionate with yourself. So let's say that you have a certain habit that you're doing every single night. You don't necessarily have to go to zero. You might just start planning, okay, I'm going to only have this 5 nights a week, right? And I know that those other 2 nights, my brain's going to want it. I'm going to allow the urge. I'm going to write that down in my journal. I'm going to track it. It doesn't have to be, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't have to track an urge. They don't have to be right next to each other, or you have to start over. Does that make sense? So let's say that you allow an urge, and then one night you don't. That's okay. Start over again. You're picking right back up at number 3, right? So they don't have to be all right back to back. So that's the main difference, right? So understand that neural pathway. Try to find, what are my triggers, right? Just objectively, like you're a scientist. Like, what are the things that are my triggers, right? Is it thoughts? Is it times a day? Is it habits? Is it emotions? When are the times that I tend to go towards those things? Notice how it feels when the urge comes up. Allow the urge, observe the urge, right? And then, trying to shift more into that prefrontal cortex and make a decision from that place versus it being this more from the toddler brain and it being just a response to that dopamine, which is only going to strengthen that neural pathway, right? That neural pathway of trigger, desire, reward, trigger, desire, reward. We're trying to break that and reverse it, just like ringing the bell and not bringing the food, okay? So again, I have a worksheet that's really helpful that talks about this and walks you through it and then allows you to track urges. And it might just be as simple as just putting a check mark or writing down the date. You don't have to make it a big thing. Some people use an urge jar. Well, they'll have like some marbles, and every time they allow an urge, they put it into the jar so they can see And their brain sees that as a reward, right? Putting that little marble in the jar feels like a reward. So those are some other ways that you can do it as well. But it's a different approach to managing urges and cravings. And ultimately, my goal for my clients is to empower them and help them. There's no right or wrong, but at least feel like they're able to make a choice, because that's where true freedom is, right? True freedom is being able to make the choice. And so many people feel like they're really not making a choice. They're acting against their own will, and they don't know how to overcome that. And they're stuck in that vicious cycle. So this is really the way out, and you can totally do it. And it makes it so much easier over time. And then now you have the skill set you can apply really to anything that you want to reevaluate. So hope that helps. I've had so much fun doing this training this week. Thank you for everyone that has reached out or jumped on live or messaged me. If you have any questions anytime, please feel free to reach out to me. I also do free consultations. So if you ever want to hop on the phone, if you have questions about something going on with you, or if you need help overcoming something, I would love to chat with you. But otherwise, have an amazing weekend, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.